Crawl through a hole in the ground in the far west of Cornwall, and about 15 feet in, the passage opens into a stone room shaped like a beehive. Granite slabs, some heavier than you are, leaning inward over your head. Walls that have held for 2,500 years without a single drop of mortar binding them together. The people who built this were among the most skilled stoneworkers in Iron Age Britain. They buried it on purpose. They hid the entrance. And then, generations later, they deliberately filled it back in. We call these structures fogous. There are fewer than 15 of them left standing. And here is the part that should bother you. After more than 100 years of professional archaeologists digging, measuring, and arguing over them, nobody can agree on what they were actually for. So what would drive an entire farming community to pour that much labour into something underground and then refuse to leave us any clear reason why? West Penwith, Cornwall. Around 500 BC. This is the very tip of Britain, the last granite finger of land before the Atlantic. The people here were Iron Age Celts, part of the world the Romans would later lump in with a tribe called the Dumnoni. They were not isolated, and they were not poor. Cornwall sat on something the ancient world wanted badly: tin. You cannot make bronze without it, and the easiest tin in Europe to reach came out of Cornish ground. Traders had been coming for it for centuries, which means these farmers at the end of the island were plugged into a network that stretched to the Mediterranean. They lived in settlements archaeologists call rounds, enclosed farmsteads ringed by an earthen bank, and in clusters of stone courtyard houses built around a central open yard. More than 2,000 of these settlements are known across Cornwall. They grew grain, kept cattle, worked metal, and raised families in roughly the same spot for hundreds of years at a stretch. And in a small number of those settlements, they did something nobody else in Britain did in quite the same way. They dug a long passage into the earth, lined it with stone, roofed it with slabs, and covered the whole thing back over with soil until it vanished from the surface. That is a fogou. The word is simply Cornish, from ogo, meaning cave. But these were not caves. A cave is something you find. A fogou is something you engineer. And here is something that deepens the puzzle rather than solving it. Fogous in this exact form are found only in the far west of Cornwall, nowhere else in England. Their closest cousins are the souterrains of Ireland and Scotland, underground passages built on the same basic idea, which tells you the impulse to dig in and line a chamber with stone ran right through the Celtic world. But the Cornish took it and made something of their own, often grander and more finished than the version up north. Whatever drove it, it was local, deliberate, and specific to these people on this granite. Here is how they built one. They cut a deep trench, then lined both walls with massive dry stone work. Large granite blocks stacked so the weight of each stone locked the ones below it in place. As the walls rose, the builders pulled each course slightly inward, a technique called corbelling, so the two sides leaned toward each other and narrowed the gap at the top. Then they bridged that gap with enormous capstones laid flat across the opening, some weighing several tons. No mortar anywhere. The structure holds itself up through weight, friction, and geometry. The floor at Carn Uni was even paved and cut with shallow drainage channels to carry off groundwater. These were not rushed jobs. They were projects a community returned to and refined across generations. Then they buried the whole thing. The Fogou at Carn Uni, near the village of Brain, is the strangest survivor of the lot. Its main passage runs about 20 metres, long enough that a grown adult can walk most of it upright. But off to one side sits a feature found almost nowhere else. A perfectly round corbelled chamber about 15 feet across, domed like the inside of a beehive. And the only original way in was a creep, a passage that suddenly shrinks to a hole roughly 1 metre high and half a metre wide, so tight you have to get down and crawl. At Carnwall, that creep was the front door. Sit with the obvious question for a second. Why build a tall, wide, beautifully finished stone passage, then force everyone to enter it by crawling on their stomachs through a hole the size of a dog flap? That contradiction is at the heart of everything, and here is the detail that makes Carnwall matter more than any other site. The Fogou was built first. The village grew up around it afterward. Whatever this thing was, it was important enough that an entire community organised itself around a structure they had already sunk underground. Hold on to that, because it cuts against the simplest explanation people reach for. Carnwall is not the only one worth knowing. On the other side of the county, on the Lizard, sits Halligai, the largest and best preserved fogou in Cornwall. Its passages run low and narrow into 3 linked chambers, and over the years the site has given up a handful of finds, including a report by a Victorian landowner of a vase holding ashes, a crudely made cup, and animal bones thought to be from a deer. Ashes in a buried chamber sound like a clue. But that report is old, the digging was careless by modern standards, and a single vase settles nothing. That is the pattern with fogous. Every find that should crack the case wide open somehow leaves it exactly where it was. That brings us to the simplest explanation. Storage. The cold larder theory. On paper it makes perfect sense. You are a farming community. You need to keep dairy, grain and meat from spoiling through a long damp winter. A stone chamber buried under several feet of earth stays at a steady, cool temperature all year. The same principle that kept butter solid in a root cellar long before anyone owned a refrigerator. Walk into a fogou on a hot August afternoon and the cold hits you immediately. Of course they used it as a pantry. Case closed. Except it doesn't hold up, and the people who actually crawl into these things will tell you why. Fogous are wet. Water seeps through the soil and pools on the floor, which is roughly the worst possible condition for storing grain or dried meat. You would be inviting rot, not preventing it. And then there is that creep again. If your goal is to stash large quantities of food, why design the only entrance so small you have to drag every sack and every cheese through a crawl space one item at a time? You don't build a warehouse with a cat door. Moving multi-ton capstones with Iron Age tools is a community-scale project that might take a season, and nobody spends that effort on a cellar. So yeah, the storage theory keeps the structure cool and explains almost nothing else. Which brings us to the second theory, the one that fits the souterrain sites elsewhere in Britain. Refuge. The argument here is genuinely strong. A fogou is invisible from above. The entrance is hidden, often inside a house. You enter by crawling through a creep, which means only one person can pass at a time, slowly and helplessly. Some fogous have side chambers and second exits that work like a sally port, a hidden back door you could slip out of while attackers were busy at the front. The archaeologist Nancy Edwards laid it out plainly. Hidden chambers, creeps, sally ports, and the fact that these structures were undetectable from the surface would all have given ordinary families somewhere to disappear when an armed band came over the hill. The researcher Kenneth McGregor made the same case, and right now the Refuge reading has solid documentary and archaeological support behind it. And there is a haunting piece of evidence that the hiding instinct around these places was real and lasted thousands of years. The Bolly Fogou, near St Buryan, sits in a valley whose name in Cornish means place of slaughter, tied by local tradition to an ancient battle. According to recorded local history, that Fogou was used again during the English Civil War, when royalists fleeing a parliamentary attack on Penzance are said to have hidden inside it. So even people in the 1600s, looking at this Iron Age tunnel, saw it for what it instinctively looked like. A place to vanish. But the version you've heard, the tidy "they hid from raiders" story, is not the full picture, because the refuge theory has a problem too, and it's the same site that broke the storage theory. Carn Uni. When archaeologists examined that fogou closely, they found none of the things you would expect in a serious defensive structure. No internal constrictions to trap a pursuer, no stumble steps, no guard positions. Just a long, open, beautifully made passage and a round domed room. You don't build a panic room with a grand hall in it. Some of the people who know these sites best came away convinced Carn Uni was never about hiding at all. Quick aside before the strangest theory of the three. The everyday side of this world, the grain these people grew and the bread they actually ate, is the heart of this channel. I've put it into the medieval bakery guides over at medievalway.store, linked below. A practical recipe book, a sourdough manual, and a sourcing guide for the real ingredients. Every copy keeps deep dives like this one coming. Alright, so here is where this gets genuinely strange. Because if it wasn't storage, and it wasn't only refuge, that leaves the theory archaeologists argue about most, and the one they're most nervous to commit to. Ritual. For decades, this word made British archaeologists wince. Back in the 1980s and 90s, the field got criticised for slapping the ritual label on anything they couldn't otherwise explain, until ritual basically became a polite way of saying, "We have no idea." So a lot of researchers learned to avoid it. But with fogous, the storage and refuge readings are so incomplete that the ceremonial possibility refuses to go away. Look at what the structures actually do to a person. A fogou is a threshold space. You leave daylight, crawl through a tight passage, and arrive in a silent stone chamber in total darkness, underground, beneath the feet of your living community. To an Iron Age people who, by the historian Barry Cunliffe's account, attributed a spirit to every part of the landscape and entered no significant act without considering the other world, that is not a pantry. That is a doorway between worlds. The specifics push it further. At Carn Uni, the round beehive chamber has a niche built into the wall opposite the entrance, shaped a bit like a fireplace, and nobody knows what it held. Some researchers argue the chamber was positioned to catch the rising sun at the midwinter solstice, sending its light straight to the back wall on the shortest, darkest day of the year. Treat that alignment claim as one reading, rather than settled fact, but the instinct behind it is hard to dismiss. At Bowley, carved into the stone of the entrance, there is the worn figure of a human with one arm raised, holding what might be a spear, a guardian maybe, or a god. You do not carve a deity into the doorway of a root cellar. And then there's the detail unique to this corner of the world, and it comes back to tin. Pulling metal out of the ground was a defining act of Cornish life, and to people who believed the earth was alive with spirits, mining was not just labour, it was taking something from the underworld. One reading, put forward by researchers like T.M. Rowe, is that the fogou is a uniquely Cornish response to that idea, a built underworld of their own, somewhere to negotiate with whatever they believed lived beneath the soil. So before you move on, sit with the stakes of that for a moment. We are not looking at a failed pantry or a clever bunker. We may be standing inside the religion of a people who left no written word, looking at the only architecture of their beliefs that survived. If you ever get the chance, go put your hand on that carving at Bowley yourself. You will understand the ritual argument in about 4 seconds, in a way no textbook conveys. There is one more clue, and it ties the whole thing together. At Carn Uni, at Halligie, at Bowden, the evidence suggests the fogous were not just abandoned, they were deliberately filled back in and sealed. And that is exactly what you would expect if these were sacred spaces. You don't casually walk away from a temple. You close it. You decommission it, the way later cultures deconsecrated a church. Remember that vase of ashes reported at Halligie. If you were closing down a sacred space, leaving something behind inside it is exactly the kind of thing you might do. So which theory is right? Here is the honest answer, and it's the answer the tidy heritage signs won't give you. Probably all of them, and none of them alone. These structures are not uniform. Each one is different. The Fogou at Cairn Uni, with its grand domed chamber and no defensive features, reads as ceremonial. Halligai, with its low passages and tight turns, reads more like a refuge. And almost any of them could have kept food cool while doubling as something far more important. Think about how an old village church worked: religious rites on Sunday, parish records stored in the week, shelter when trouble came, the anchor of the whole community. Spaces in the ancient world were rarely single-purpose. We are the ones who insist on one tidy answer, because a single function is easier to print on a sign than the truth, which is that these people were more complicated than we give them credit for. The real loss isn't that we don't know. It's that we used to know, and the knowledge died with them. Somewhere in West Cornwall around 2,000 years ago, every person in that village could have told you in one sentence exactly what the Fogou was for. That sentence is gone. We are standing in the answer, in the dark, unable to read it. But here is the practical part, the reason this is worth more than a shrug at a mystery. The engineering still works, and you can still use the principles today. Start with the building method. A corbelled dry stone, earth-covered chamber is one of the most durable structures a human can make with no machinery and no cement. The corbelling carries the load inward and downward through the stone itself. The buried soil locks everything under steady pressure, and the lack of mortar is a feature, not a shortcut, because there's no rigid binder to crack and fail as the ground shifts and freezes over centuries. That is why a Cornish farmer's underground room has outlasted nearly every cathedral built with lime mortar 1,000 years later. The second principle is passive cooling, and people are rediscovering it right now as energy gets expensive. A space surrounded by earth doesn't swing with the weather. The ground a few feet down holds a stable, cool temperature year-round, which is the entire logic behind a root cellar, an earth-sheltered larder, or a modern Burmid house that barely needs heating or air conditioning. The Iron Age builders of Cornwall understood thermal mass without a word for it. If you have ever wanted to store apples through the winter or keep a pantry cool without a humming machine, the Fogou is the working prototype, minus the damp problem, which you solve with drainage they often skipped. And the most practical thing of all, you can go stand inside one. Two of the best are open to anyone for free. Halligai, on the Trelawarren estate on the Lizard, is the largest and best preserved, a real walk-in passage with branching chambers. Cairn Uni, near Penzance, gives you that astonishing round beehive room. Both ask only that you bring a torch and don't mind getting your knees wet. Go soon, because these sites are fragile. The Fogou at Chisorster has already been packed with sand to stop it collapsing, and roofs at other sites have caved in. The window to crawl into the actual thing and feel it for yourself is not going to stay open forever. So back to where we started, 15 feet underground, surrounded by stone that has held for 25 centuries. Forget for a moment whether the Fogou was a pantry, a panic room, or a temple. The harder thing to sit with is this. Are people skilled enough to build something this lasting and certain enough about why to bury it and seal it with their own hands, handed down their single greatest work, and not one word to explain it? We didn't lose a building. We lost the meaning, and the meaning was the whole point. If this was worth your time, hit like and subscribe, because this channel goes after exactly this kind of buried knowledge, the things people built with care and then let the world forget. And tell me in the comments, of the three theories, storage, refuge, or ritual, Which one do you actually believe? And what forgotten structure should we crawl into next? Keep investigating,